What is there to say? Milo the goat stole the show. Everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. So today I'm coming to you with a very exciting review video, and that is of course for the Shadow and Bone Netflix TV show. So I absolutely loved the show. I think overall it did a fantastic job of adapting the two different series and, you know, combining the timelines, but they also had an incredible cast that was so true to the characters, some brilliant music, beautiful sets and costumes, and just some great chemistry between the actors for the various characters that they were playing. And I am just so excited to talk a little bit more in depth about each of the things that I loved and some things that I kind of wish they had done differently. So this video is going to be split into a few sections. So I'm going to first talk about how I feel about the way they combined the different series and timelines and how the overall adaptation was. And then I'll get into the various characters and their arcs and, you know, some favorite moments. And then I'll get into some major differences from the books and things that I kind of wish they had done a bit differently. And then I'll get into my theories for next season, God willing that there is one, and what I hope for that next season. Okay, so let's talk about the two different series and how they combine them, and also what I think of the adaptation as a whole. So I think they did an amazing job of bringing the two timelines together. As you know, if you have read Six of Crows, Six of Crows takes place a few years after the end of the entire Shadow and Bone trilogy. So after the end of Ruin and Rising and all of the repercussions of what happens at the end of that. And so I thought it was really interesting the way that they kind of brought this together, and I'm curious also how this is going to play out in the next season and if they are going to shorten some of the time in between the two series or if they're going to keep that time in between. It was really exciting to see from the first episode the way that they were kind of weaving the Crow's story in, and we get this whole sequence of, you know, Inej bringing this job to Kaz and talking about how Dreesen has brought someone by a boat and not knowing who this person is and needing a heartrender to get some information out of them, and that all connects back to when they are on the skiff in Shadow and Bone and Alexei jumps off that skiff. It was really interesting to me because in the books, Alexei actually dies on the skiff. And so when he jumped off, I was like, oh, that's interesting. But when he stumbles out of the fold later on and we see that he survived, you're like, oh my God, like what is the, you know, repercussions of this? And we later get that scene in that basement of Dreesen's place where Alexei is in that chair. And he is the one bringing this news to the Crows and to Dreesen, and which results in the job for the Crows to go kidnap Alina. Another interesting connection that I love that they did with a minor character that was already in the Shadow and Bone series was with Fedor. So Fedor appears in the carriage at the beginning of Shadow and Bone with Alina and Ivan. And Fedor in the books is actually a very minor character. He kind of shows up at that beginning part, shows up again in the Winterfett, and then isn't really talked about afterwards. He's just known as a heartrender and as being kind to Alina when she is taking that journey to the little palace. But I love how they wove in this extra kind of plotline for Fedor where the Darkling tells him to go find Nina, and that Nina, who has been his spy up until now, hasn't been reporting back because she has suddenly gone missing. And it's just the way that it kind of connected that the Darkling had her on this mission, and he knew about the fact that she would be joining up with the Crows and that she would be his spy for this little mission that they were trying to pull off. But it all goes awry when the Druskele kidnap her and where she ends up meeting Matthias. I think the way that they wove in all of that, and then Fedor coming back at the end to get Nina and, you know, causing the little snag in her plan where she and Matthias were kind of thinking about running away together, and then she is forced to give Matthias up to the slavers so that he can be saved from certain death with the Grisha, but which also sets in course the, you know, events of Six of Crows and how Matthias is locked up in that prison in Kerch and how he hates her at the beginning of that book. I also love how, you know, the Crow story really weaves into what is already there in Shadow and Bone. There is talk in Shadow and Bone when you are reading it that Alina, you know, intends to escape with the performers of the fete. That's what Bugger tells her to do. And that's exactly what she does in the show, but it just ends up being that the Crows are masquerading as these performers, and so it all just comes together very perfectly. And then another parallel to the actual book is when at the end on the sand skiff for that final kind of showdown, there are these ambassadors and delegates, and the Crows kind of use that opportunity to get on the skiff to go across the fold again. And it just all tied into the book as it was already, which I thought was just so cool, and the way that they were able to weave that together, and how it all also added to the Crow's story and to the characterization of each of them, and how you can see that kind of extend further in Six of Crows. So yeah, overall I just love how they kind of amplified these side characters and used them as these vehicles to bring the Crow's story into Shadow and Bone, and really just made it a very seamless kind of interweaving. Another thing I really loved about the adaptation, and this is of course because this is a TV adaptation, you know, Shadow and Bone, the books were written in first person from Alina's perspective, and so we only get this very narrow view of what's going on, only from Alina's point of view. And so one of the most exciting things about the adaptation was getting to see the story from so many different perspectives, not only the Crows, but also getting to see the Darkling's perspective at some times, with the whole backstory for him in episode 7, which is based off of a short story that Lee had written, but also just seeing Mal's side of the story. I think people who have only read the books, there is this sense that from Alina's perspective, we don't really know what Mal is doing, we just think he's being uncaring, and getting to see his side of the story and seeing how much he struggles to go and get to Alina and, you know, be there for her is just so heartwarming and exciting. Another really exciting thing about bringing these two series together is getting these showdowns and the team-ups that we never would have gotten otherwise, and it's just something that you kind of only imagine and dream of getting, and then getting to see it on screen was just amazing. And you can probably tell that I'm getting at the scene with the Darkling and Kaz, where they sort of have this showdown in the street when the Darkling is looking for Alina, and he thinks that Kaz and his crew have her, but Kaz is like, no, we don't. And the Darkling is pretty much ready to kill Kaz off, but of course, Kaz always has another trick up his sleeve, and that, like, epic moment where he drops the flash bomb and the Darkling is like whipping out the cut, and the way that Kaz just disappears is just so fantastic. And it's just so exciting because so many of us have had that mental imagination of, you know, who would win in a showdown, the Darkling or Kaz, and I think there was a clear winner and it was fantastic. Another fun part and like team up that I loved was seeing the Crows and Mal and also Zoya sort of team up at the end on the skiff and try to help Alina and stop the Darkling. It was just fun to see like our characters from these different series kind of come together and work together, and you know, it was just so cute and I loved it so much. It's just so interesting to see how like Kaz is like, okay, if he's not on the Darkling side, then he's on our side, and then when Mal wants to go up and, you know, be stupid, Jesper and Nej are on his side and follow him up there, and it's just so much fun just seeing them all work together. And then seeing the teamwork between Zoya and Nej at the end was just so fantastic. I loved that they were trying to help each other out, and it was just so heartwarming to see them all at the end around that campfire, you know, trying to support each other, and seeing like Alina give Nej the knife that she later names after Alina, you know, Sancta Alina, which you get to see in Six of Crows, which is so cool. It was also really great just seeing, you know, that moment when Alina kind of pops out of the back box on the carriage that they were taking out of the little palace, and when, you know, she sort of blinds the three crows, but Nej is smart enough to cover her eyes, but she just lets Alina go because she wants her to succeed, she wants her to escape, and she knows she's the real deal. And it was just nice seeing how these characters would interact in canon, and it was just really exciting in that way. And also just seeing them on that boat later on coming all together, and, you know, seeing Nina show up on that boat as well was super exciting, and I have so many questions for season 2. Okay, so let's get into the characters and what I thought of them, and also talk about the casting. I absolutely loved the casting for every single character, and it's very rare that I am this happy with casting, but I think everyone did such an incredible job. Everyone kind of looked like the characters that they were portraying. They all played their characters really well, and I think the chemistry that they had between the different characters really embodied the characters in the books. Like when I was watching Freddie and Amita on screen, I felt like I was watching Kaz and Nej. They just so perfectly embodied what I imagined in my head when reading those books, and they also just brought their own heart to the characters. One thing that I really enjoyed about this adaptation was the way that they changed Alina's, you know, race. So in the books, she is just plainly Ravkan, but in the show she is half Shu, and I really liked how it wasn't just a colorblind kind of casting. Jessie Mei Lee is half Chinese, so it was really exciting to see how, you know, she isn't just like there for diversity's sake. Like the whole story kind of surrounds this idea that she is half Shu and that she feels like an outsider, and it was just interesting to see like the little microaggressions that she goes through throughout the series, and how she's trying to kind of rise above all of that, and how she kind of takes control of herself and her self-worth by the end. I absolutely loved seeing so many Malina moments on screen. If you guys have been following me for any amount of time, you know that Mal and Alina are one of my favorite couples. I think they are just a great embodiment of that like childhood friends to lovers trope, and they are just so wholesome and just the sweetest couple ever. And I think reading them in the book, they were fantastic, but seeing them on screen was just even better. I think that the way they adapted the books, you know, with getting more of Mal's perspective was just so great because we got to see so many parallels in the way that they felt about each other. Like seeing the scenes from when they were kids was just so much fun, and all of like the little backstory scenes that they sort of extra filmed, like when Alina's like trying to learn to fight and Mal is giving her pointers, like that's not something that's in the books, but the fact that they added it in was kind of nice, and I really like that. I also really loved how at the end of episode 2 they do these parallels of the two of them like going to bed and, you know, really missing each other, and how it parallels to when they were kids hiding from the Grisha testers, you know, holding hands in that field. It was just so beautiful. I also really love the parallels between them in episode 4 towards the end when Alina is trying to let go of Mal and, you know, accept her power, and Mal on the other hand is deeply in search of the stag, and he has gone through hell and high water to, you know, find it for her. And he has this moment at the end of that episode where he's like, "You are my true north and I can see my way to you now," which parallels back to I think the end of episode 3 when Alina is saying that, you know, he was her true north and that she feels lost without him. I think they just did such a great job, and I think Jessie May Lee and Archie were just so great about, you know, portraying their characters and showing the love between them and just showing how, you know, they are each other's homes. And it was just so great to see it on screen. And yeah, it's funny because a lot of people keep saying that, you know, Archie is making them love Mal, and that the way he's playing him and, you know, the way that the show kind of adapted Mal is making them love him. But it's funny because the characterization of Mal in the show is exactly the same as the characterization of Mal in the books. I think it's just you get more visibility in the show because you're getting it from Mal's perspective rather than hearing about it afterwards when he tells Alina what is going on. And then of course we have the Darkling, and I think that Ben Barnes did such an incredible job of playing the Darkling, and I also just think he ended up being the perfect casting for the Darkling. He has that sort of ageless quality to him. He has that like charming voice and attractive look to him, and he has that way of like seeming so sincere even though he may be lying to you, which is what the Darkling is basically doing the entire series. And I love the way that they brought such mystery to him in that first episode because we never actually see him head on in the first episode. And it's funny because in the books, you know, we get to meet the Darkling quite quickly in the books. I think it's only like a couple chapters before Alina kind of reveals her powers, and then she's brought to that tent to meet the Darkling, whereas we spend a full episode dealing with everything before that, and then we finally meet the Darkling in episode 2. But even before meeting him in episode 2, we get all these little hints. We see him in the cloak, and we see him stepping out of the carriage when he shows up at the first army camp, and it was just so interesting how they wove this mythology around him, and even getting like the crows talking about him in Ketterdam was just so interesting. I also really loved seeing his backstory in episode 7. I think it was really fun to get that in like the main storyline because we hear hints of his backstory throughout the original trilogy, but it's mainly in these like side short stories that Lee wrote that we get like the full dramatized backstory for the Darkling. So getting to see that in episode 7 was really interesting, and seeing his relationship with Baghra. But another thing I thought that was really interesting was the way that the adaptation made it seem even more that the Darkling really believed what he was saying. He was always telling lies, as we know, but I think he just so truly believed in his mission and what he was doing, and that he was right, and that, you know, creating a home for the Grisha was all he really wanted. Even though, you know, there's times when he's like making these speeches to Alina about how, you know, he's just trying to do the right thing and he thought that she was on his side. And I think in the books I was so convinced that, you know, he was just tricking her the entire time. But I think the show made it seem a lot more like he truly believed that Alina was on his side, that he wasn't just tricking her, that he wanted her to be on his side, but his methods from, you know, having lived forever and having tricked so many people, he just falls into these habits and he doesn't see anything wrong with it, but obviously there is. And so it was just so great how like deluded he was, if you will, and I just loved how they portrayed him and how Ben Barnes portrayed him. He is really a villain who believes himself to be the hero. Okay, and then let's talk about Kaz and Nej and Jesper. I think these guys just like were so fantastic. Their chemistry was just amazing, and I loved seeing these characters in kind of extra content that we don't get in the books. We know a bit of their backstories from Six of Crows, but we don't get any of like the stuff that happens pre Six of Crows sort of dramatized. And so it was just fantastic seeing Jesper and how hilarious he was, his connection to Milo the goat and hugging the goat, but also being amazing with his guns. Like, Jesper was fantastic. And it was also just like interesting to see him like flirt with the stable hand and, you know, get distracted, but also seeing him like gamble away the money. And I think his character pre Six of Crows and pre the character growth that he goes through in Six of Crows was just so interesting to see in this series. And then another thing I really loved about seeing Jesper was the way that he was often the buffer between Kaz and Nej in the show. And we kind of get this in the books, but I think it's really amplified in the show because we're only getting the 3 characters and we're not getting the other crows just yet with them. And so we have like that scene where Nej comes to Jesper and, you know, drinks his shot and is talking about how Kaz is just so bent on revenge. And then Kaz immediately comes later and, you know, also drinks Jesper's shot and is also kind of confiding into Jesper. And there's a lot of like moments where Jesper is kind of vouching for one or the other character, but is ultimately letting the 2 of them just make their own decisions. Like the part where Nej is stitching her wound and she is considering leaving and, you know, not going with Kaz and Jesper back to Ketterdam, trying to just take her freedom while she has it. And Jesper kind of makes a case for Kaz that, you know, Kaz would never let you go back to the menagerie. He would never put you in that position again. Then he also sort of takes her side and tells her, I don't have the right to tell you what you should do with your shot at freedom. And I think that that was like a really great moment because Jesper is just such a supportive friend to both of them. And I loved seeing like the friendship and, you know, jokes that he and Nej do, but also like the relationship that he has with Kaz. And I think that their like dynamic between the 3 of them was just so fantastic. And then of course I absolutely loved the dynamic between Kaz and Nej and how it was portrayed on screen. Like from that very first scene in the Crow Club when Kaz is washing his hands and he just senses that Nej is here and that she's behind him and he says, hello, Nej. It's just so amazing how they portrayed that exactly from the books, like how he just always knows she's around. I also just love how they, you know, really portrayed the very strong bond that they have. And one of the parallels that I loved that they drew to the Shadow and Bone series is when one of Mal's friends, when he's trying to stop Mal from like going off to save Alina by himself and like going on his crusade, he is explaining to the other friend that when our closest friend is in trouble, we do foolish things. And that scene immediately cuts to Kaz coming to the menagerie to taunt Helene to give the Crow Club deed to buy Nej's indenture away and let her come with them. And I think it's just so wonderful how they drew that, you know, connection between Mal and Alina and how they are friends and feel for each other, but also Kaz and Nej. And then another thing that I absolutely loved that they kind of examined throughout the relationship between Kaz and Nej was the idea of faith and how that tied to Shadow and Bone and the idea of Alina as the saint. And as we know, Nej is this very pure character. She doesn't want to kill, but she ends up killing for Kaz to save his life. But just the way that, you know, she has this great faith in the saints, and, you know, that's one thing that she has left from her mother, and how she wants to believe in the impossible. And Kaz is so cynical, he doesn't want to believe in it, and he just wants to believe that Alina is just this girl with these magical powers, and even at the beginning he wants to believe that she's a fraud. But they get to that point where, you know, Nej is kind of frustrated with them and she might consider leaving, and he's like, are you saying goodbye to me? And then he's sort of explaining to her that he has never had faith in a higher power, and then he says, no saint has ever watched over me, not like you have. And it was just such a perfect moment. You know, he believes in people, he believes in Nej and Jesper and himself, but also he feels like he has kind of been abandoned by any kind of higher power. But it was also just amazing to see the kind of character growth, the minor character growth that he goes through in the Netflix show, where by the end on that ship in the final episode, when someone asks, is Saint Alina dead? And then Kaz replies, I don't know if she's dead, but she's definitely a saint. And that entire line and the, you know, look that Nej gives him right after, she is proud that he has kind of come around and he's starting to believe in the power of just having faith and believing in Alina and what she could do for all of them. Another thing I loved about seeing Kaz and Nej sort of separately even was getting hints of their backstories in this adaptation. And so seeing how the kind of goals that they have in Six of Crows aren't much different from right now. And so like Kaz is obsessed with, you know, one-upping Pekka Rollins lessons from what he did to him as a child. And then Kanej is, you know, so focused on trying to find her family and what happened to them, and just seeing her at every moment trying to figure that out was just so interesting. You know, when she's interrogating Arkin, or when they're in West Ravka and she's looking at the lists of people who have died in the fold. It was just really interesting to see more of their backstories kind of dramatized. Now let's talk a little bit about the major differences from the book and some things that I kind of wish they had done a bit differently, or that they adapted one way and I think still worked a little bit better in the books. One thing that I thought was really cool was the way that they changed the amplifiers. So in the books, the stag amplifier is just a necklace, and oftentimes they refer to it as a collar, which I thought was interesting. But in the adaptation, they made it seem a lot more visceral and kind of grotesque in the way that it kind of sinks into her skin, but it's also like poking out. And it was just so like uncomfortable to look at. And when Alina kind of claims her power, it sinks all the way down. And I thought that that was very symbolic and, you know, just so cool. And it also kind of takes away the need for them to have this collar on her for the entire series, because that's what happens in the books. So one major thing I think that came off a little strange to me was the way that the adaptation, I really think, was made for people who had already read the books. And I think to a certain extent, if you haven't read the books, it turns out a little bit underdeveloped, especially in the Shadow and Bone storyline, and specifically I think to do with the relationship between the Darkling and Alina. One of the things that the show did in order to bring the Crow's characters in was they extended a lot of the time at the beginning of the Shadow and Bone book and the end of the Shadow and Bone book. We get an entire episode on that sand skiff at the end, whereas in the book I think it's only like a chapter or two. Same with the scenes on the sand skiff at the beginning of the show. That's an entire episode, whereas all of that content is maybe a couple chapters in the book. Majority of the book actually takes place in the little palace, and seeing Alina kind of learn to try to use her powers and, you know, coming to terms with her feelings for Mal and then letting them go and kind of getting enraptured by the Darkling, and seeing the slow way that he convinces her to believe in him and to believe all of his shit, and also the way that he convinces her that she needs to have this amplifier and that it'll make everything easier for her, and the way that she sort of completely falls for him before Mal shows up again, and, you know, she starts to realize that maybe she wasn't thinking right, and then Baghra obviously tells her what's what. But I feel like in the show, that entire part in the little palace was a lot shorter, and I think the number of scenes that we got of Alina training and learning things about the Grisha were slightly a little bit underdeveloped. There is a character in the book named Botkin who also shows up in the show. He is the combat trainer, and he shows up for that one very short scene, but in the books he has this like really nice connection with Alina, and he shows up in the later books as well. And he's that one side character that I feel like they really didn't give enough to, and I really wish that they had, because he happens to be Shu. He happens to be from the same country that Alina is from in the show, whereas in the books she isn't. And so I feel like they kind of missed that opportunity to have that connection. And I also feel like the relationship with Baghra was a little bit underdeveloped as well, and I wish they had added a little bit more of the scenes from the book where Baghra and the Darkling kind of interact, and it all sort of hints towards that grand reveal that the Darkling is actually not so great. And in the book, I think there is this way that the Darkling kind of says things to Alina and convinces her that he means the best for her that I don't think really translated on screen. We do have that whole idea of him sending David with the gloves to kind of make Alina dependent on them, but I don't think it really translated as well as it was in the book. In the books, the gloves actually don't have that large significance. It's just something that she uses. They have mirrors on them so she can reflect light, so it's less about amplifying or, you know, giving a crutch to her powers. It's just like giving a new skill to her. But in the books, actually, the Darkling spends a lot of time telling her that he's going to look for the stag, that this is going to be something that's going to make her stronger, and that she won't have to train as hard. And so she starts to kind of accept that as a crutch. But in the show, they did this like interesting thing about how she's having these dreams of the stag, and she's drawing these illustrations of the stag, and the Darkling like steals those pages and, you know, sends the First Army trackers out to find them, and that's how Mal ends up on that, you know, journey. But I think it was a little bit more straightforward in the books, and I think it made more sense in the books, I think, personally, that, you know, the Darkling had this idea of getting Morzova's amplifiers and wanted to get that stag, and so sends out these trackers from the First Army to locate the stag to make an amplifier for Alina. I think the little bit of roundabout way that they did it in the show is kind of interesting and slightly strange. And then one last thing that I really wish they hadn't taken out from the book content when they adapted to the show was this beautiful, beautiful speech that Mal makes right before they find the stag. And it's just this really beautiful kind of speech that he makes of what he's gone through while they were apart and how he came to realize how he loved her and telling her how much she means to him. I think there was just a little bit of that disconnect where even though the show was able to portray in real time, you know, Mal making these realizations, we didn't get to see him kind of confessing them to Alina. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when I say Mal's speech from the books, this is the speech. So he says to Alina, "Did you miss me, Alina? Did you miss me when you were gone?" And she said, "Every day." And then he says, "I missed you every hour. And you know what the worst part was? It caught me completely by surprise. I'd catch myself walking around to find you, not for any reason, just out of habit, because I'd seen something that I wanted to tell you about, or because I wanted to hear your voice. And then I'd realize that you weren't there anymore, and every time, every single time, it was like having the wind knocked out of me. I'd risked my life for you. I've walked half the length of Ravka for you, and I'd do it again and again and again just to be with you, just to starve with you and freeze with you and hear you complain about hard cheese every day. So don't tell me we don't belong together," he said fiercely. He was very close now, and my heart was suddenly hammering in my chest. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you, Alina, but I see you now." And it's a little bit interesting because they, like, add that last line from the speech into the show, and I think that that was powerful, but I think everything he says before that is what makes it so powerful. But I guess also we do get to see a lot of this dramatized, so there was no reason to have him say the words again. But I think from the perspective of seeing, you know, the realization come to Alina of her knowing that he had done all this and her hearing from his own lips that this is what he feels, I think that that was a little bit more powerful. And I also just think that the timing of that, you know, speech right before they find the stag is what made it also really, really interesting. You know, right when they come to this like crux moment, that's when the stag appears. But it's also interesting because the Darkling was kind of listening in during that entire exchange in the books. All right, now let's finally get into some of my theories for next season and what I'm kind of hoping for and some questions that I have. So for those of you who have read the books, we know the next one is Siege and Storm. And if you haven't read Siege and Storm and Ruin and Rising, I would probably stop watching right now because I'm going to spoil these a little bit. But as we know from Siege and Storm, we get to meet Nikolai in that book, and I'm very, very excited for who they're going to cast for Nikolai and, you know, how that's all going to come together in the story. One thing that I think is going to be super interesting is how the Crow story is going to work into the storyline of Siege and Storm, and if they are going to change the timelines. So as we know, Six of Crows takes place a couple years after the end of Ruin and Rising, but the way that they've kind of set up the end of season 1 of the Netflix show, it kind of seems like we could actually just jump straight into the Six of Crows storyline, just straight into the heist at the ice court in Ferda. And to a certain extent, I think they could do that because it would line up the 2 books from the duology with the last 2 books in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. But I also think that there are a lot of aspects to the way that the Six of Crows series is a new change in landscape. This is after Ruin and Rising has finished. Gerda is on the scene and it's this like new drug. And I think that if they introduce it for the Six of Crows kind of storyline, it would be strange if it wasn't introduced also into the storyline of Shadow and Bone. So I'm curious if they're going to jump straight into the Six of Crows like storyline, or if they're going to give them extra content once again for maybe another 2 seasons before they move on to Six of Crows. It's also interesting because at the end of season 1, we're seeing them all on the same boat, which was very, very interesting to me because obviously the Crows are going to Kerch, but in the books, Mal and Alina actually escape on foot and they don't yet reach a boat. And in Siege and Storm, they end up on a ship, and it ties into them wanting to find the second amplifier, which is the like fish creature, and that is where they end up meeting up with Nikolai. But I'm curious, since they're on the same boat as the Crows, if they're maybe going to be going to Kerch, or if they're going to be stopped along the way, or if they're going to like another port and then, you know, the Crows will diverge off. And I'm also just curious if we do end up getting more extra content from the Crows, and if we're not launching into the Ice Court heist storyline, if we're going to get the Crows in more kind of Shadow and Bone related storylines. Like if they're going to get involved with the Nikolai storylines, or, you know, some of the like epic battles in Ruin and Rising, or if they're just going to go back and have their own kind of storyline in Kerch. Because that's one thing that they kind of touch on, that they need a Heartrender, that they, you know, need to take their place back in Kerch. So I'm really interested to see what they're gonna do with all of those storylines. And then of course I'm super excited to see, you know, at the end of season 1 we get that final scene of the Darkling walking out of the fold with the Volcra and just telling them to follow, and that we know of course from the books in Siege and Storm that the Darkling can now kind of command the Volcra without doing anything with his hands. He just like says a word or thinks something and they'll do it, and it kind of connects to how his power has sort of amplified since getting sort of consumed by the fold at the end of Shadow and Bone. So I'm interested to see how much more evil he's going to be in season 2 and just how Ben Barnes is going to portray him and, you know, how deluded he is. And I'm just excited for everything, really. And also just some of like the later storylines in Siege and Storm and how they like come back to the little palace and kind of reclaim things. I'm super excited for all of that. But I think that's all of my thoughts for the Shadow and Bone Netflix series. Those were mostly my major top level thoughts on the show, how I felt about it in general. There were a lot of small little scenes and moments that I would love to like break down and talk about, but we'd be here for hours. So yeah, just know I absolutely loved it, and there were so many parts that I just cannot get over, and I have already like started rewatching it because I just, you know, need more Shadow and Bone in my life apparently. So yeah, I'm just so happy with this adaptation and just love getting to see our characters on screen, and I'm just gonna be crying as we wait for the next season, which is probably not gonna come out for like another few years because they, you know, haven't even started shooting it. So, and it hasn't even been renewed. So I'm just very, very excited for when that eventually comes along. But thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know down below what you guys thought of the Netflix adaptation of Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows. Did you like the series? Did you not? Did you wish they had done some things differently? What were your favorite parts? And let me know your favorite Milo the Goat moments, because he was the best part. And just let me know any of your thoughts on the show. I would love to discuss a lot more in the comments, and let me know if there's anything that I said that, you know, you agree with or disagree with and want to discuss more. But yeah, go check out my Instagram, Twitter, and Goodreads in the description down below for more bookish thoughts and just daily life updates, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!